The most powerful weapon of medieval empires was not a sword. Behind every great kingdom's expansion lay a quiet infrastructure of measurement, a system so mundane it is easy to overlook. While historians celebrate military conquests and administrative reforms, the gradual imposition of standardized weights and measures made imperial expansion sustainable. Before these standards existed, every town, manor, and market used its own local units for weight, length, and volume. This chaotic diversity created costly friction for merchants, confusion for tax collectors, and endless opportunities for fraud. But when rulers began to impose uniformity, they unlocked something far more potent than any army: the ability to tax efficiently, trade reliably, and supply armies across vast distances. In this video, we will trace that hidden transformation from the Carolingian reforms to the early colonial period, showing how rulers turned simple measures into tools of centralized control. What if the real engine of empire was never a weapon at all, but a standard bushel and a ruler's decree? A single merchant traveling from London to Paris in the 12th century would have needed to translate his goods through at least half a dozen different measurement systems along the way. In one market, a pound meant something entirely different than it did just a few days' ride away. This was the fragmented world before standardization, a landscape where every town, every manor, and every market held its own private definition of weight, length, and volume. In London, merchants used the Tower Pound, named after the Royal Mint inside the Tower of London. But in the same city, traders of precious metals relied on the Troy Pound, while dealers in everyday goods favored the avoirdupois pound. These were not small differences. The Tower Pound weighed about 350 grams, the Troy Pound slightly less than that, and the avoirdupois pound tipped the scales at roughly 450 grams. A merchant buying wool by 1 pound and selling by another could gain or lose a significant portion of his cargo without ever touching the goods themselves. Beyond pounds, the bushel was just as chaotic. A bushel of wheat in one region might hold a different volume than a bushel of oats in another county, and both could differ from the bushel used for barley in a nearby duchy. For tax collectors, this patchwork was a nightmare. A lord trying to collect grain dues from his tenants could not be certain whether the bushel he received matched the one he expected. Peasants learned to exploit these ambiguities, presenting their dues in the smallest local measure while demanding payment in the largest. Fraud became woven into the fabric of daily exchange, not because people were dishonest by nature, but because the system itself invited confusion. Every transaction required negotiation, every trade carried hidden risk, and every ruler who dreamed of uniting a realm faced a stubborn obstacle that no army could conquer. The very tools that should have made commerce fair and predictable had become instruments of suspicion and delay, and until someone dared to impose a single standard across an entire kingdom, the dream of a truly unified economy would remain just that, a dream. Charlemagne was the first ruler in centuries bold enough to try imposing order on this chaos. In the late 8th century, as he forged an empire stretching across much of Western Europe, he understood that a unified realm needed more than swords and oaths. It needed a common language of trade, so he introduced the livre, a pound of silver that became the foundation of his monetary system, and with it the silver penny, a coin that carried not just value but the promise of royal authority. Every penny was supposed to weigh the same, every livre was meant to hold the same amount of metal. For a time, the system worked. Merchants across the Carolingian heartland could exchange goods with a new confidence, knowing that a pound in Aachen held the same weight as a pound in Paris. Tax collectors could assess dues without endless bickering over local measures. But Charlemagne's vision was fragile. His empire was held together by personal loyalty and military might, not by deep bureaucratic structures. When his successors proved less capable, the realm fractured into warring kingdoms, and with the fragmentation of political power came the fragmentation of his standards. Local lords began to mint their own pennies, gradually reducing the silver content to stretch their treasuries. The livre itself drifted in meaning, becoming a unit of account rather than a physical weight. By the 10th century, Charlemagne's dream of uniformity had largely dissolved, leaving behind only a memory of what might have been. Meanwhile, far to the east, other empires faced the same challenge. The Byzantine Greeks maintained a remarkably stable system of weights and measures for centuries, anchored by the gold solidus coin and the strict oversight of the imperial bureaucracy. But even in Constantinople, local variations crept in during times of instability. The Islamic caliphates, too, developed sophisticated standards, drawing on earlier Persian and Roman traditions. The dirham and the dinar were carefully regulated, and the quinta, a standard measure of weight, helped facilitate trade from Spain to Central Asia. Yet these systems, impressive as they were, remained tied to the fortunes of their dynasties. When political unity faltered, so did the uniformity of measures. The real breakthrough, the transformation that would make standardization stick, required something more durable than a single ruler's decree. It required the rise of stronger centralized monarchies, kingdoms that could enforce standards generation after generation, and the emergence of commercial networks so vast that they demanded consistency to survive. That turning point was still centuries away, but the seeds planted by Charlemagne and his contemporaries had begun to change how rulers thought about power. They had learned that control over measurement was control over wealth itself. By the 11th century, a new force began reshaping the old chaos of measures. Across Europe, trade was stirring back to life after centuries of localized subsistence. Long-distance commerce, once a risky venture reserved for the boldest travelers, gradually expanded. Merchants from Italian city-states carried silks and spices northward. Flemish weavers shipped woolen cloth to the great markets of the Rhine, and at the crossroads of this growing network stood the Champagne fairs in northeastern France. These fairs were not just marketplaces, they were massive temporary cities of commerce where traders from dozens of regions gathered to buy, sell, and exchange everything from horses to manuscripts. But here lay an awkward truth. Every merchant arrived with his own local system of weights and measures. A bale of wool measured in the cloth ell of Bruges had no agreed relationship to the ell used in Troyes. A pound of pepper from Genoa weighed something different from a pound of pepper sold just a few stalls away by a trader from Provence. The result was constant haggling, endless conversion, and ever-present suspicion. For merchants, these inconsistencies were not mere annoyances. They represented real costs. Every time a deal required a complicated translation between measures, the risk of error or fraud grew. A clever seller could exploit ambiguity, using a heavier measure when buying and a lighter one when selling. To protect themselves, merchants began to demand clarity. They formed guilds, associations that set their own internal standards for members, and pressured local lords to enforce uniform public measures. The Champagne fairs themselves became laboratories for this push. Counts of Champagne, eager to attract traders and boost revenue, issued charters that standardized the weights and measures used in their fairs. They appointed official inspectors, known as wardens, who tested scales and bushels against a master set kept under lock and key. A merchant caught using a false measure could be fined or have his goods confiscated. This was not charity. It was good business. Consistent measures reduced disputes, sped up transactions, and made the fairs a magnet for even more trade. The idea spread. Across Europe, town councils and princes began to realize that uniformity could be a source of strength. The great commercial cities of Italy, such as Florence and Venice, carefully regulated their measures. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of northern trading towns, developed its own common standards for the Baltic and North Sea routes. For the first time since Magna, pressure for standardization was rising not primarily from emperors but from merchants themselves. They understood that a pound had to be a pound, whether you were in London, Bruges, or Cologne, and they were willing to lobby, pay, and even pressure rulers to make that happen. This bottom-up demand would soon meet the ambitions of kings who saw in standardization a way to extend their reach, tax more efficiently, and build the infrastructure of centralized power. For medieval kings, the right to define a pound was a form of power as tangible as any sword. This was not just about commerce, it was about authority itself. When a ruler declared that his realm would use only the measures he approved, he was drawing a line around his sovereignty. Every bushel, every yard, every gallon became a small but unmistakable statement of who held ultimate control. And the language they used to justify this power was carefully chosen. Kings did not present standardization as a land grab or a power play. They framed it as protection. They argued that their subjects deserved honest trade, that unscrupulous merchants and local lords had been cheating the people with false measures, and that only the crown could guarantee fairness. In England, this idea took deep root. The Assize of Weights and Measures, issued in the 13th century under King Henry III, declared that there should be one weight, one measure throughout the realm. The standard for dry goods became the Winchester bushel, a precise volume kept under royal authority. Every town was required to have its own copy of this bushel, certified against the master standard held in London. Inspectors known as the King's Messengers traveled the countryside, testing local measures and punishing those who deviated. The penalty for using a false bushel could be severe, including fines and even seizure of goods. Across the English Channel, the French monarchy pursued a similar path. The livre poids de marque, a standard pound based on a carefully calibrated weight kept in the royal treasury, became the benchmark for all transactions in the kingdom. Parisian goldsmiths and merchants were required to have their weights tested against this master standard. The crown appointed officials called the Gardes des Poids et Mesures, who conducted regular inspections and confiscated any instruments that did not match. This was not mere bureaucracy. It was a quiet assertion of central authority over a realm still fragmented by local loyalties. In both England and France, these standards were not abstract concepts. They were physical objects kept in locked chests in treasuries and town halls. The master standard was often made of bronze or iron, etched with official marks, and stored in multiple locations to prevent tampering. Copies were distributed to major cities, where they were displayed publicly so that any citizen could bring their own weights and measures for comparison. This visibility was intentional. It reminded everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest peasant, that the crown was watching, that the king's reach extended into the very marketplace, and that the right to define what was fair and honest belonged not to local lords or guilds, but to the sovereign alone. Over time, this steady enforcement did more than reduce fraud. It reshaped the relationship between ruler and subject. People began to see the crown not just as a distant authority that collected taxes and waged wars, but as a guarantor of basic fairness in daily life. That trust was a kind of currency too, one that kings spent wisely as they built the bureaucracies and loyalties needed to hold vast territories together. And once rulers understood the power of a single measure, they began to dream of extending that uniformity far beyond their own borders. One clause in Magna Carta promised to end the chaos of measures once and for all. In the year 1215, as English barons confronted King John at Runnymede, they did not only demand limits on royal power, they also insisted on a simple, sweeping decree that would reshape daily life for everyone. Chapter 35 of that great charter declared that there should be one measure of wine throughout the entire kingdom, 1 measure of ale, 1 measure of corn, and 1 width of cloth, whether dyed, russet, or haberjit. On the surface, this was a technical regulation, but for the men who wrote it, standardization was a matter of justice. They had seen how local lords and merchants manipulated bushels and ells to cheat their neighbors. They knew that a peasant bringing grain to market could be given a short measure, that a widow buying cloth could be sold a yard that was secretly smaller than the king's yard. The Charter aimed to make such fraud impossible by forcing every market to use the same royal standards. More than that, it linked the crown's legitimacy directly to the promise of fairness. A king who could not guarantee honest weights had failed in his most basic duty, and a kingdom where measures varied from town to town could never truly be united. The clause was bold, but enforcing it was another matter. 12th century England lacked the bureaucracy to inspect every village market. Local customs died hard, and many barons simply ignored the decree when it suited them. For decades, the promise of 1 measure remained more aspiration than reality. Yet the legal precedent had been set. The idea that uniform weights and measures were a royal obligation, not a luxury, took root in English law. Over the following centuries, kings from Henry III to Edward I issued new statutes that repeated and expanded the Charter's demand. The Winchester bushel became a fixed standard. The yard and the pound were defined with increasing precision, and every time a monarch reaffirmed those standards, they were echoing the language of Magna Carta. The Charter had turned a practical need into a constitutional principle. From that point on, any ruler who neglected uniformity risked being seen as unjust. The quiet power of a single measure had become part of the contract between sovereign and subject. A single bushel of wheat could determine the fate of a kingdom. In the medieval world, grain was not just food. It was the foundation of power, the currency of taxation, and the fuel for armies. Every loaf of bread, every ration for a garrison, every bushel collected as rent or tax represented a claim on the land and its labor. And because grain was bulky, perishable, and produced in scattered fields, its measurement became the most urgent challenge for any ruler who wanted to turn harvests into military strength. The system that evolved around grain measurement was meticulous and surprisingly sophisticated. At its heart stood the bushel, a vessel of fixed volume, but even a bushel was not enough. For large-scale taxation, the quarter became the standard unit, equivalent to 8 bushels. This made calculating total yields and dues far simpler. A lord who knew how many quarters his tenants owed could plan his year. A king who knew how many quarters his realm produced could plan his campaigns. But the key to making this work was enforcement. In England, the Exchequer, the Royal Treasury and Audit Office maintained the official standard bushel. This was a bronze vessel, carefully calibrated and stored under lock and key. Copies were sent to every shire town where sheriffs were required to inspect local measures against them. Twice a year, the Exchequer's own officials traveled the country to test bushels and scales, punishing anyone found using false measures. This was not an occasional check. It was a constant, systematic effort to ensure that every bushel of grain collected for the king was exactly what it claimed to be. The reason for such rigor was simple. Grain taxes were the lifeblood of medieval royal finance. Kings did not collect silver coins from every peasant. They collected grain which they then sold, stored, or used to feed their households and armies. Without reliable measurement, the entire system would collapse. A shire might send 1,000 bushels to the royal granary, but if those bushels were smaller than the standard, the king received far less than he expected. That shortfall could mean the difference between fielding an army and watching it starve, and so the crown invested enormous effort into making those bushels honest. The Domesday book, compiled in the late 11th century, recorded not just land holdings but also the expected yields in grain, measured in standardized units. This allowed the king to calculate, with surprising precision, how much each estate could contribute to a campaign. 100 hides of land in one county might be assessed at a certain number of quarters of wheat for the king's army, and that number was trusted because the measure behind it was known. The impact on military expansion was profound. When a king planned an invasion of France or a campaign in Scotland, he did not simply call for volunteers. He calculated how many days of rations were needed, how many quarters of grain that required, and how many carts and ships were necessary to transport it. Standard units made this calculation possible. A commander could say, "We need 300 quarters of wheat for the next month," and his quartermasters knew exactly what that meant. They could requisition the grain from royal stores, knowing that every quarter held the same volume as every other. Without that consistency, armies would have been forced to live off the land, foraging and requisitioning as they went, which was slow, unpredictable, and often provoked local resistance. The ability to supply an army from a central granary using measured rations gave kings a strategic advantage. They could march farther, campaign longer, and project power into regions where foraging would have been impossible. Grain measurement, in other words, was a silent enabler of territorial expansion. It allowed rulers to convert the abundance of their fields into the reach of their swords. Yet the system was never perfect. Local officials sometimes skimmed grain in transit using their own private bushels. Peasants found ways to hide part of their harvest. But the steady pressure of the exchequer's inspections kept these abuses within bounds. Over centuries, the habit of measuring grain by a royal standard became so ingrained that it shaped everyday language. People spoke of a bushel of wheat, a quarter of barley, as if these were natural facts rather than royal decrees. The standard had become invisible, woven into the fabric of economic life. And that invisibility was its greatest strength. When a king could count on every bushel being the same from one end of his realm to the other, he could count on his grain taxes. And when he could count on his grain taxes, he could count on financing the campaigns that extended his borders. The quiet work of bushels and quarters, of bronze measures and traveling inspectors, made the grand drama of conquest possible. The next time you see a loaf of bread, consider this: its humble ancestor helped build empires. Grain was not the only thing that needed measuring. The land itself, the source of all that grain, had to be counted, described, and valued if a king hoped to know what his realm was worth. And in the year 1086, William the Conqueror ordered a survey so thorough that people called it the Domesday Book, as if it were the final judgment. His officials fanned out across England, asking endless questions. How many hides of land did this manor hold? How many plows worked those fields? How many villagers, freemen, and slaves lived there? The hide was a deceptively simple unit. It was supposed to represent enough land to support one free household, roughly 120 acres in theory. But in practice it varied enormously by region because soil quality and local customs shifted the definition. William's commissioners needed a more consistent way to compare one estate with another, so they recorded not just hides but also detailed assessments of value in pounds and shillings. They counted livestock, meadow, pasture, even fish ponds. The result was a staggering catalogue of wealth that allowed the crown to levy taxes, settle disputes, and plan military campaigns with a precision that had never existed before. The hide was not the only unit in play. In northern England, where Danish influence lingered, surveyors used the carucate, which roughly matched a hide but referred specifically to the amount of land a team of 8 oxen could plow in a season. In other regions, the bovate, the land of a single ox, allowed even finer grained accounting. These units were not arbitrary. They were tied to agricultural reality, the capacity to produce, and therefore to the ability to pay taxes. But the real breakthrough came when surveyors began to measure land by the rod. The rod, also called the perch, was a fixed length, traditionally 16.5 feet in the English system. It became the foundation of a grid. An acre was defined as an area 1 furlong long and 1 chain wide, and a furlong was 40 rods. By using the rod as a standard, surveyors could calculate areas with consistency. A lord who knew the number of acres in his manor could predict his grain yield, plan his rents, and defend his boundaries in court. Over the following centuries, this practice spread. Manorial surveys, monastic cartularies, and royal inquisitions all relied on the rod to produce maps and records that turned vague landscapes into precise numbers. Kings extended their reach by knowing exactly how much land each vassal held. When a baron rebelled, the crown could confiscate a measured estate and reassign it without guesswork. When a new tax was levied on land, the assessors knew how many acres to count. This ability to catalogue territory transformed the relationship between ruler and land. Before the Domesday Book and the surveys that followed, much of a kingdom was known only through local memory and rough estimates. Afterward, it became a ledger. Every hill, every field, every wood could be converted into a number, and every number could be taxed. The quiet work of rods and perches, of hides and carucates, gave medieval rulers a map of power that was more reliable than any army. They could see their realm not just as a patchwork of loyalties but as a measurable resource, and once they could measure it, they could take it apart and build it back again. The land itself had become a tool of expansion, one that required no battle, only careful counting. Every rod and perch that measured land also reshaped the life of the merchant, though in a quieter, more daily way. The same push for uniformity that allowed kings to tax grain and map manors reached deep into the marketplace, where it solved a problem that had plagued traders for generations. That problem was time. Before standard measures were enforced by law and backed by visible authority, every transaction was a negotiation in miniature. A merchant arriving at a fair with a bale of wool could not simply name a price and collect his coin. First, he had to agree with the buyer on which pound they were using. Was it the heavy pound of the local lord, the lighter pound of the neighboring county, or the merchant's own pound that he had carried from home? Each possibility changed the value of the goods. So the two parties would haggle not just over price but over the very definition of what they were trading. This back and forth could stretch for minutes, sometimes longer, and every minute of argument was a minute lost. Multiply that by dozens of transactions in a single day, and the cost became enormous. A trader might spend more time arguing about units than actually selling his goods. And even after the deal was struck, there was no guarantee that the measure used was honest. A clever seller might subtly shave his bushel or stretch his ell, pocketing a small extra profit that the buyer would never detect until it was too late. To protect themselves, merchants began to build trust through visible standards. In English market towns, the local guild often maintained its own set of official weights and measures, certified by the crown and marked with a seal. That seal was a promise. Any merchant who used a sealed measure could point to it and say, "This is the king's pound, not mine." The buyer could see the mark, recognize its authority, and accept the weight without suspicion. This simple act, a stamped piece of metal on a scale, eliminated the need for lengthy haggling. The transaction became faster, smoother, and far less risky. Over time, this principle spread beyond guild halls. Many towns embedded their official standards directly into the fabric of the market square. A bronze bushel might be chained to a stone pillar, a set of iron weights displayed under a covered arcade, open for anyone to test their own measures against. A merchant could walk up, compare his bushel to the town standard, and prove his honesty in moments. The cost of verification dropped from a lengthy argument to a single glance. These small efficiencies, repeated thousands of times across countless markets, had a profound effect. Trade volume grew because uncertainty shrank. A merchant who knew he could sell his goods quickly, without endless haggling over measures, could afford to take more risks, travel farther, and carry larger loads. He could set a price based on the market, not on the suspicion that he might be cheated. And when everyone trusted the standard, the entire network became more profitable. The same wool that once changed hands slowly, burdened by friction and doubt, could now flow from the shearing shed to the loom to the market stall with remarkable speed. The merchant's burden had lightened, and the reason was not a grand invention or a dramatic battle. It was a seal, a bronze weight chained to a pillar, a simple promise that a pound was a pound. That promise, repeated across thousands of towns and enforced by kings who saw its value, quietly built the commercial infrastructure that made medieval expansion possible. The merchant who trusted the standard could move faster, and the kingdom that guaranteed the standard could grow richer. When a merchant held a silver penny, he was holding a tiny piece of the king's authority. That coin was not just a medium of exchange. It was a measured object, a precise weight of precious metal that had been struck under royal supervision. And that weight was the foundation of its value. A penny was supposed to weigh 1/240th of a Tower pound, roughly 1.5 grams of pure silver. Every penny in the realm, at least in theory, was identical to every other. This uniformity was not a convenience. It was the promise that made trade possible across distance and time. A merchant in York could accept a penny from a stranger because he knew, without testing, that it held the same silver as a penny minted in London. That trust was the invisible glue holding together a growing network of exchange. And the link between coinage and the broader system of weights was direct. The Tower pound itself, the very standard for weighing silver, was the same pound used for other goods in the marketplace. A penny was literally a fraction of that pound, a physical embodiment of the king's measure. When a merchant counted out 240 pennies, he held exactly 1 Tower pound of silver. That meant the same scale that weighed his wool or his grain could also verify his coins. The measurement system was seamless, and that seamlessness strengthened its authority. But that authority was fragile. When a king faced financial pressure, perhaps a war or a shortage of silver, the temptation to debase the coinage was almost irresistible. Debasement meant reducing the silver content of each penny while keeping its face value the same. A king could mint more coins from the same amount of bullion, stretching his treasury to meet immediate needs. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it destroyed trust. Merchants quickly noticed that a penny from 1 year weighed less than a penny from a decade earlier. They began to demand payment in older, heavier coins or simply raised their prices to compensate for the weaker currency. The system of standardized weight, so carefully built, began to crack. The most famous example came in the 14th century, when the English crown repeatedly reduced the silver content of the penny to finance the 100 Years' War. By the end of that conflict, the penny had lost nearly half its original weight. The result was inflation, suspicion, and a growing preference for barter among those who could avoid coinage altogether. Yet even in that troubled period, the ideal of a sound coinage based on a fixed standard never disappeared. Kings who issued debased coinage were seen as dishonest, not just by merchants but by their own subjects. The expectation that a penny should weigh what it claimed was deeply ingrained, and when rulers managed to maintain that standard, the benefits were enormous. Sound coinage made credit possible. A merchant who knew his future payments would be in reliable pennies could extend credit to a buyer hundreds of miles away. He could write a letter of credit promising payment in a set number of coins and trust that the coins would hold their value when the debt came due. This was not abstract finance. It was the daily mechanism that allowed wool from England to be sold in Flanders, that allowed Italian bankers to fund English campaigns, that allowed spices from the East to reach northern markets. Long-distance credit, the fuel of medieval commerce, rested entirely on the belief that a coin's weight would remain constant. That belief was built and maintained by the same system of standardized measures that governed bushels and yards. The penny was the most visible symbol of that system, a tiny metallic promise that the king's authority extended into every purse and every transaction. And when that promise was kept, the entire economy grew stronger, richer, and more connected. The quiet work of ensuring every penny weighed the same made possible the credit networks that financed cathedrals, crusades, and the slow expansion of European influence across the continent. While kings across Europe struggled to impose their standards from above, a very different kind of uniformity was taking shape in the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. The Hanseatic League, a loose confederation of North German trading cities, built its empire not with royal charters or conquest, but with a simple, stubborn insistence on practical uniformity. For these merchants, standardization was not a tool of royal ambition. It was the bedrock of survival in a dangerous and unpredictable trade network. The League's heart was the city of Lübeck, and from there its influence spread across the Baltic and into the North Sea, linking ports from Novgorod to London. At the center of this web was a single weight, the Lübeck mark. This was not a coin, but a standard of mass, roughly 233 grams of silver. Every Hanseatic merchant who shipped goods through League ports was expected to use the Lübeck mark as the basis for weighing his cargo. A bale of furs from Russia, a barrel of herring from Scania, a sack of grain from Prussia, all were measured against that one consistent standard. The League did not have an army to enforce this. Instead, it relied on something far more powerful: collective self-interest. A merchant who used a false measure was not just cheating a buyer. He was threatening the trust that made the entire network possible. The League's councils in each member city appointed inspectors who regularly tested scales and weights. Those caught cheating could be fined, barred from trading, or even expelled from the League altogether. This was a stunningly effective system. Hanseatic merchants could trade across thousands of miles without ever needing to renegotiate the basic units of their transactions. A merchant in Bruges knew that a Lübeck mark in his hand held the same silver as one in Riga. That certainty gave them a decisive edge over their rivals. Independent traders operating outside the League had to constantly adapt to local measures, losing time and risking fraud at every stop. The Hansa merchants, by contrast, moved swiftly, their goods already weighed and priced according to familiar standards. This bottom-up uniformity was not imposed by a distant king. It was demanded by the merchants themselves. They understood that a single standard was worth more than any tariff or monopoly. And because they enforced it among themselves rigorously and consistently, they turned the Baltic Sea into a vast, efficient marketplace where the pound meant the same thing everywhere. The Hanseatic League grew wealthy and powerful, not through military conquest, but by quietly perfecting the art of trusting a weight. Their example proved that standardization could arise from the simple, relentless logic of commerce without a crown in sight. The guilds of medieval Europe understood that a pound was only as trustworthy as the hands that measured it. While kings and leagues dreamed of sweeping uniformity from above, the real work of making measurement a lived reality happened in cramped workshops and bustling market stalls, where master craftsmen enforced standards with an iron will and a watchful eye. Every guild, whether of bakers, goldsmiths, or weavers, maintained its own set of master weights and measures, locked away in a strongbox and brought out only for inspections. These were the physical anchors of trust. A bronze pound weight stamped with the guild seal sat next to a wooden yardstick that had been painstakingly compared to the royal standard. The sheer iron bushel used for measuring grain was not something a member could casually adjust. If a baker's loaf was found to be underweight, or a cloth merchant's ell shorter than the guild yard, the penalty was swift. The master of the guild, often accompanied by 2 wardens, would visit each member's premises without warning. They carried their own scales and measures, testing the merchant's tools against the guild standard. A balance that tipped even slightly off could be confiscated and broken. The offending member was summoned before a guild court, a panel of fellow craftsmen who could levy fines, confiscate goods, or even expel the cheater from the trade entirely. Expulsion was the harshest punishment, for it meant losing the right to practice a craft, a sentence that could destroy a family's livelihood. This internal policing might seem harsh, but it served a larger purpose. By ensuring that every measure used by its members was honest, the guild protected its own reputation. A buyer who purchased cloth from a guild member knew that the yard was true, that the L had been tested, that the weight of the silver matched the guild standard. That trust allowed guilds to charge higher prices and attract customers from far away. In cities like Bruges and Ghent, the Drapers' Guild even employed a full-time inspector who traveled between workshops with a set of brass weights and a measuring rod. The inspector's word was final, and any dispute could be settled on the spot. This granular enforcement made standardization a part of daily life, not a distant decree. A baker waking before dawn to knead his dough did not think of the king's bushel. He thought of the guild's bushel, the one he had seen inspected last week, the one that sat in his shop and reminded him that his livelihood depended on being honest. The same was true for the carpenter cutting timber, the brewer filling barrels, the mason laying stone. Every time they measured, they were unconsciously reinforcing the idea that a unit of measurement was a fixed, reliable thing. Over generations, that habit of mind became second nature. People stopped questioning whether a pound was really a pound. They simply trusted, and that trust, built one guild inspection at a time, created the invisible foundation upon which larger imperial systems could later rest. When kings and empires eventually imposed their own standards across whole kingdoms, they were not starting from scratch. They were building atop a world that had already learned to believe in the honesty of a measured pound. The guilds had done the quiet, patient work of making uniformity a reality long before any crown thought to claim the credit. When Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than soldiers and priests. They carried a set of measurements that would quietly redraw the map of the world. The same logic that had unified a realm in Europe, the logic of a single pound, a single bushel, a single yard, now became a tool for controlling continents. In the Americas, the Spanish crown imposed the Castilian vara, a unit of length roughly equivalent to 83 centimeters. This vara became the standard for measuring land grants, laying out towns, and surveying the vast estates that would produce the silver and sugar that fueled an empire. Alongside the vara came the feinga, a measure of dry volume used for grain and, crucially, for the tribute that indigenous communities were forced to pay. A feinga of corn or wheat was a fixed amount, and that fixity allowed colonial officials to calculate exactly how much each village owed. The same feinga that measured a peasant's harvest in Mexico also measured the grain stored in the holds of ships bound for Seville. This uniformity made the extraction of wealth astonishingly efficient. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to the labor of indigenous people, was organized around these measures. A settler might be entitled to a certain number of feingas of corn per year, or a specific length of cloth measured in varas. The standards turned human labor into a predictable, quantifiable resource. Historians have noted that the feinga, in particular, became a weapon of control. By imposing a single measure on a landscape that had never used it, the Spanish erased centuries of local knowledge. Indigenous farmers who had once measured their harvests in baskets or heaps now had to conform to a foreign standard, and if they fell short, the penalties were severe. The Crown's inspectors could check the tribute against the official feinga kept in the local treasury. Any shortfall meant debt, punishment, or forced labor. The system was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be predictable, and predictability for an empire was more valuable than gold. On the other side of the world, the Portuguese carried their own standards into Asia. In ports from Goa to Macau, they erected stone pillars called padros. These were not just markers of territory, they were physical embodiments of Portuguese measurement. Carved into the stone were the official units of length and weight, the padrão de medidas that merchants and officials could consult. A trader could walk up to a padrão, compare his cloth or his spice bags against the carved marks, and know instantly whether he was being cheated. The Portuguese crown required that every major trading post maintain its own padrão, and inspectors regularly checked that local merchants were using honest measures. This was not about fairness to Asian traders. It was about ensuring that Portuguese ships returned to Lisbon with cargoes that matched the records. The same standard that measured pepper in Cochin also measured it in the royal warehouses in Lisbon. That consistency allowed the Portuguese crown to tax imports with precision, to plan military expeditions, and to supply its far-flung forts with predictable rations. The ability to apply familiar units to entirely new territories gave empires a way to project economic control across oceans. A fainga in Peru was the same as a fainga in Castile. A vara in the Philippines matched a vara in Madrid. This meant that colonial resources, whether silver, sugar, or spices, could be integrated directly into the metropolitan economy without endless conversion and dispute. The empire did not need to learn local systems. It simply imposed its own, and because those systems were backed by law, by inspectors, and by the threat of punishment, they stuck. Over generations, local populations adapted. They learned to think in varas and faingas. They built their houses along grids laid out by the same rod that measured land in Spain. The quiet standardization of colonial space made it legible to rulers thousands of miles away, and legibility, as every empire knows, is the first step toward control. The same rod that had once divided a manor in England now divided a continent. A single book could make a standard travel farther than any inspector. Before the age of print, the knowledge of official weights and measures was passed down mostly by word of mouth, by local memory, and by the physical objects themselves, the bronze bushels and iron pounds locked away in guild halls and royal treasuries. If a merchant in a distant town wanted to confirm the exact length of the king's yard, he had to send a messenger to the nearest city that held a certified copy. That journey could take days or weeks, and even then, the copy he received might have been made from another copy, with small errors creeping in at every step. The written word changed everything. The first official manuals of measurement were not meant for the common trader. They were compiled for the king's own officials, the clerks and sheriffs who had to enforce uniformity across a kingdom. In England, the assize of weights and measures from the 13th century was more than a law. It became a reference text. Scribes produced multiple copies, each painstakingly handwritten on parchment, and sent them to shire courts and market towns. The text defined the pound, the yard, the bushel, and the gallon in precise language. It explained how to test a balance, how to measure a bushel of wheat, how to calculate the correct weight of a loaf of bread. For the first time, an official in York and an official in Cornwall could read the same words and arrive at the same understanding of what a pound should be. In France, the royal treasury produced the livre de change, a handbook that laid out the relationship between the various pounds and measures used across the kingdom. It listed conversion factors so that a merchant from Provence could see exactly how his local pound compared to the Parisian livre poids de marque. This was not just a convenience. It was a tool of absorption. By documenting local measures and linking them to the royal standard, the crown could gradually erase them, replacing local custom with a single, written truth. But these handwritten manuscripts were rare and expensive. A single copy might cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year. Only the wealthiest monasteries, cathedrals, and royal officials could afford them. The real revolution came with the printing press in the late 15th century. Suddenly, A manual of weights and measures could be produced in hundreds of identical copies. A merchant in a small town could buy a printed conversion table for a few pennies and keep it in his shop. He could compare his own scales against the printed figures, and if a customer challenged him, he could point to the page. The printed word carried an authority that handwritten notes never could. It looked official. It looked permanent. One of the most influential printed works was the English Tractatus de Ponderibus et Mensuris, a treatise on weights and measures that went through multiple editions in the 16th century. It included detailed tables for converting between the many pounds still in use, the Tower pound, the Troy pound, the avoirdupois pound. It explained how to test the purity of silver and gold coins by weight. It even gave instructions for measuring the capacity of barrels and casks. For the first time, a merchant in Bristol and a merchant in London could consult the same printed page and agree on what a pound of wool meant. The printing press did not create uniformity by itself, but it amplified every effort that kings and guilds had already made. A royal decree became a printed broadsheet posted in market squares. A guild standard became a printed pamphlet distributed to every member. A conversion table became a pocketbook carried by traveling merchants. The old world of oral tradition and local memory began to fade, replaced by a new world of printed reference. People stopped relying on what their grandfather had told them about a bushel. They relied on what the book said, and the book said the same thing everywhere it was read. That silent, portable authority became the quiet engine of a new kind of empire, one held together not by swords but by pages. But the story of standardization was never simple. The very measures that kings and merchants praised as tools of fairness often felt like weapons of exploitation to those who had to live by them. When a lord or a royal official arrived in a village with a new bushel, one that was larger than the one the villagers had used for generations, they did not see progress. They saw a demand for more grain, more labor, more of everything they could barely spare, and they did not accept it quietly. Across medieval Europe, the imposition of uniform weights and measures sparked fierce resistance. In France, the salt tax known as the gabelle was particularly hated, not just because of the tax itself, but because the crown insisted on measuring salt by a single royal standard. Local communities had long used their own measures for salt, measures that varied in size and allowed them some flexibility in how much they paid. When royal officials began enforcing the standard bushel, effectively increasing the amount of salt required for the same tax, anger boiled over. In the year 1341, a revolt broke out in the town of La Rochelle. Crowds attacked the salt warehouses and drove out the tax collectors. The rebellion was crushed, but the memory of it lingered. For decades afterward, any attempt by the crown to standardize measures in the salt trade met with suspicion and quiet sabotage. In England, the peasant uprising of 1381, often called the Peasants' Revolt, had many causes, but among the deepest grievances were the ways landlords manipulated measures to extract more rent and labor. When a lord changed the size of the bushel he used to collect grain from his tenants, or when he demanded that a day's plowing be measured by a longer rod than the village had always used, the peasants understood exactly what was happening. They were being cheated. The old measures passed down through families and generations were not arbitrary. They were tied to the land, to the sweat of their labor, to what a man could reasonably produce in a season. A bushel that had always meant a certain amount of grain was a boundary that protected them from ruin. When that boundary shifted, their survival was at stake. The revolt itself was brutally suppressed, but the issue did not disappear. In the years that followed, local communities continued to resist through quieter means. They hid their old measures. They told surveyors that a certain field had always been a different size. They shared whispered warnings when royal inspectors approached. The written records of the time are full of cases where villagers were fined for using unauthorized bushels or for refusing to adopt the official yard. In one manorial court in the 14th century, a group of tenants was accused of keeping a secret set of weights that matched the old, smaller bushel. When the Lord's bailiff came to collect the grain rent, they presented their grain in the new, larger bushel, but they had secretly used the old measure to fill it, effectively shortchanging the Lord. It was a small, defiant act of resistance, a way of saying that the old ways still mattered. This pushback was not simply stubbornness, it was a defense against exploitation. In a world where the margin between survival and famine was razor-thin, a slightly larger bushel could mean the difference between having enough grain to last the winter and being forced to buy back food at inflated prices. Local communities understood that any change in measurement was rarely neutral. It almost always favored the powerful, the landlord who collected rent, the king who collected taxes, the merchant who sold goods. By clinging to their traditional measures, villagers were not rejecting progress. They were protecting themselves from a system that often used uniformity as a tool of extraction. The quiet war over the bushel and the yard was a war over who controlled the terms of survival, and it was fought not in grand battles but in the daily friction of market stalls, manorial courts, and household kitchens. The resistance to new measures was real, but the demands of war proved even harder to ignore. When a king needed to feed an army camped 1,000 miles from home, he could not afford the luxury of local variation. A soldier's ration had to be predictable, a ship's cargo had to be calculated in advance, and that required a language of measurement that everyone, from the quartermaster in London to the supply clerk in Bordeaux, spoke the same way. The English crown faced this problem acutely when it tried to hold onto its territories in southwestern France, the region known as Gascony. For decades, English kings maintained a chain of castles and garrisons along the Garonne River, far from the supply depots of the homeland. Every barrel of flour, every cask of wine, every bundle of arrows had to be shipped across the English Channel and then hauled inland. The margin for error was thin. If a garrison was undersupplied, it might mutiny or surrender. If it was oversupplied, the cost bankrupted the treasury, so the crown's clerks developed a meticulous system. They calculated that a soldier needed about 2 pounds of bread per day, plus a pound of meat or fish, plus a gallon of ale every few days. These figures were not guesses. They were based on years of records, all measured in the king's pounds and bushels. A commander requesting supplies for 100 men for a month knew exactly how many bushels of wheat that required. The clerks in London could check his figures against their own tables, and if the numbers did not match, they demanded an explanation. This system worked because everyone used the same standard measures. The bushel that was used to calculate the flour ration was the same bushel that merchants used to sell grain in the markets of Bordeaux. The pound that weighed the salted pork was the same pound that the ship's captain used to calculate the cargo weight. Without that uniformity, the whole operation would have collapsed into chaos. Across the Mediterranean, an even more impressive example was taking shape. The Venetian arsenal was not just a shipyard, it was a factory for war capable of producing a fully equipped galley in a single day. The secret to that speed was standardization. Every component of a Venetian galley, from the planks to the oars to the rigging, was built to precise, unvarying specifications. The length of an oar was determined by the width of the galley, which itself was measured in the Venetian foot. The iron fittings were forged to match templates kept in the arsenal. The sails were cut to standard sizes. A shipbuilder could walk to a rack, pull down a pre-cut plank, and know it would fit without any adjustment. This was not just efficient, it was revolutionary. It meant that the arsenal could stockpile parts, repair damaged ships in hours instead of weeks, and assemble an entire fleet on demand. And the foundation of this entire system was a set of fixed measurements that had been agreed upon, written down, and enforced for generations. The Venetian government understood that if each shipbuilder used his own private foot, the parts would never fit. So they maintained master standards kept under lock and key, and inspectors regularly tested the tools of every master craftsman. The result was that Venice could project naval power across the eastern Mediterranean with a reliability that no rival could match. A Venetian fleet could sail in April, fight all summer, and return in October, knowing that every broken spar could be replaced from the arsenal stores. The same logic applied to the supply of armies on land. Without standard measures, a general could not know how many carts he needed to carry his grain, how many horses to pull them, how many days of forage to plan. Every variable was a guess, but with standard bushels and pounds he could calculate with ruthless precision. He could say that his army of 10,000 men needed 300 bushels of wheat per day. He could calculate that a cart drawn by 2 horses could carry 20 bushels. He could therefore determine that he needed 15 carts per day, plus 50 carts to carry reserve supplies. Those numbers allowed him to plan a campaign, to know how far he could march before his supplies ran out, to decide which roads to take and which towns to seize. The difference between a successful campaign and a disastrous one often came down to the accuracy of those calculations, and that accuracy depended entirely on the quiet, unglamorous work of standardizing a bushel and a pound. The armies that marched farthest, the navies that stayed longest at sea, the empires that held onto distant territories for decades, all of them relied on this invisible infrastructure. It was not the bravery of soldiers or the genius of generals that made expansion possible. It was the ability to count, measure, and predict with a confidence that only uniformity could provide. The same precision that fed armies also filled the ledgers of kings. When a monarch could trust that every bushel of grain collected from a distant shire matched the bushel recorded in his treasury, something quietly revolutionary happened. He could begin to count, not just in vague terms of plenty or scarcity, but in exact numbers that could be compared across years and across regions. This ability to count with confidence was the seed from which the first true bureaucracies grew. The English Exchequer, that great audit office with its checkered cloth table and its meticulous records, did not emerge from a love of paperwork. It emerged from the need to verify that every penny and every bushel owed to the crown had actually arrived. And the only way to do that verification was to have a fixed standard against which everything could be measured. The Exchequer's officials, the barons and the clerks, did not simply rely on the word of local sheriffs. They demanded written accounts, tallies, and receipts, all expressed in the king's pounds, shillings, and bushels. A sheriff who reported a surplus of grain could be cross-checked against the harvest records of his county. A sheriff who reported a deficit had to explain why. The standard measure turned a vague claim into a testable number. Without that number, the entire system of accountability would have collapsed into endless argument. On the other side of the channel, the French crown developed its own chamber of accounts, a body that performed the same function for the Kingdom of France. Its clerks sat in a vaulted room in Paris, surrounded by chests of parchment rolls. They reviewed the accounts of every royal official, every tax collector, every baillie in charge of a district. Again, the foundation of their work was the liverpoids de marque, the standard pound of silver, and the standard measures for grain and wine. When a baillie reported that he had collected 1,000 livres in taxes, the clerks in Paris knew exactly what that meant. A liver was a liver, regardless of whether it came from Normandy or Languedoc. This uniformity allowed the chamber to compare the efficiency of different regions, to spot patterns of fraud, and to hold local officials accountable for shortfalls. Over time, these audit institutions grew more sophisticated. They began to produce annual summaries, budgets, and forecasts. They developed a language of revenue and expenditure that was consistent from one year to the next. A king could look at his accounts and see, at a glance, whether his treasury was growing or shrinking. He could plan a campaign, a building project, or a marriage alliance with some confidence that he understood his resources. This was not trivial. For centuries, rulers had governed largely by instinct and by the advice of a few trusted men. Their knowledge of their own wealth was often vague, a mix of memory and rumor. But with standardized measures and the bureaucracies that relied on them that began to change, power became legible, a realm became a balance sheet. Of course, this new bureaucracy did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, pushed forward by the same pressures that had driven the push for uniformity in trade. Kings needed more revenue, more efficiently collected. They needed to know exactly what their kingdoms could produce, and they needed a class of literate clerks who could turn measurements into records. Those clerks, often drawn from the clergy or from the rising merchant class, became the backbone of the administrative state. They did not fight battles. They did not lead armies, but their careful columns of numbers, each one rooted in a standard pound or a standard bushel, made the work of expansion possible. The empire that could count could also plan, and the empire that could plan could reach farther, hold tighter, and last longer than any that relied on memory alone. The quiet work of measuring and recording, of auditing and comparing, was the scaffolding upon which the grand ambitions of medieval kings were built. Without it, the dream of empire would have remained just that, a dream. The habits of uniformity forged in medieval markets never truly faded. They were inherited, refined, and eventually codified into the systems that still shape our world today. When the French revolutionaries of the late 18th century set out to create a new system of measurement, one based not on royal decrees but on nature itself, they were not starting from scratch. They were building on centuries of accumulated experience, on the quiet conviction that a single standard could unite a people. The metric system, with its meter defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, was a radical departure from the liver and the foot. But its underlying logic, the belief that uniformity made trade fair and administration efficient, was a direct inheritance from the medieval past. The revolutionaries had seen how the old royal measures had been manipulated by lords and tax collectors. They wanted something that could not be tampered with, something that belonged to all citizens equally. Yet the very idea that a government could impose a single system across an entire territory was a lesson learned from generations of kings and guilds. Across the English Channel, the story unfolded differently but with the same deep roots. The British imperial system, formalized in the 19th century, was not a clean break but a consolidation. It took the medieval yard, the pound, the bushel, and the gallon, all of them shaped by centuries of royal statutes and merchant practice, and defined them with new precision. The yard was set by an Act of Parliament in the early 1800s, based on a bronze bar kept in London, much like the master standards that had sat in the Exchequer since the time of Henry III. The pound was redefined as the avoirdupois pound, the same one that had been used for trade in the Middle Ages. The imperial system was not invented from nothing. It was a formalization of what had already become habitual. These two systems, the metric and the imperial, would go on to spread across the globe, carried by the empires that inherited the medieval tradition of central authority. French colonial officials brought the metric system to North Africa and Southeast Asia. British administrators imposed the imperial yard on India, Australia, and Canada. In each case, the local measures that had governed daily life for centuries were gradually replaced by the standards of the distant capital. The same logic that had driven the Hansa merchants and the Carolingian kings was at work again, only now on a planetary scale. And the legacy of that medieval push for uniformity is still visible today, though most of us never notice it. When you fill your car with gasoline, the pump measures in liters or gallons, units that trace their ancestry back through centuries of standardization. When you buy a kilogram of rice, you are relying on a system that emerged not from a single moment of invention, but from a long, slow process of agreement and enforcement that began in the market squares of medieval Europe. The global supply chain that brings goods from factories in one continent to stores on another depends on the ability of every participant to trust that a ton is a ton and a meter is a meter. That trust, built over hundreds of years, is the invisible foundation of modern commerce. The quiet work of the medieval inspectors, the guild wardens, the royal clerks, and the Hanseatic merchants created a world where measurement is so reliable that we rarely think about it. And yet, it is precisely that reliability that makes our interconnected economy possible. The legacy of a pound that was once a piece of silver in a king's treasury is now a digital signal in a computer at a container port, ensuring that the cargo ship arrives with exactly what it promised. The medieval dream of a single, honest measure has become a quiet, global reality. And the next time you pay for a loaf of bread, remember that somewhere in that transaction lies a chain of trust stretching back 1,000 years, a chain forged not by kings and generals alone, but by the patient, persistent work of people who insisted that a pound should be a pound. The grandest cathedrals of history were not built by armies alone, but by the quiet precision of a bushel and a yard. For centuries, we have told ourselves stories of conquest, of generals and kings, of battles won and territories claimed. But behind every successful expansion lay a hidden skeleton of measurement, a system so mundane and so deeply woven into daily life that we rarely stop to notice it. Standardized weights and measures were not a mere footnote in the story of empire. They were the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without them, taxation was guesswork, trade was a gamble, logistics were a nightmare, and administration was a slow, chaotic process that could never stretch far enough. The empires that lasted, the ones that held vast territories across generations, were the ones that solved this problem. They learned to count, to measure, and to trust the numbers they produced. And that trust, built 1 pound at a time, 1 bushel at a time, turned the chaos of local custom into a predictable machine of extraction and control. The next time you look at a map of a former empire, do not just see the borders and the battlefields. See the hidden lines of measurement, the silent threads that held it all together. See the bronze weights locked in treasuries, the printed tables carried by merchants, the written records that allowed a king to know exactly how much his realm could produce. These were the quiet tools that made power possible. History is full of flashy inventions, gunpowder, printing presses, steam engines. But sometimes the most transformative technologies are the ones that seem simplest, the ones we take for granted. A pound is a pound, a yard is a yard, and once you can agree on that, you can build an empire. So here is a question for you, the viewer. What do you think is the most underappreciated technology in the story of human expansion? Is it the humble bushel, the standard yard, the coin that never changed weight, or perhaps something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more of these hidden mechanisms that shaped our world, consider subscribing, because the most powerful forces in history are often the ones we never see.